A Musical Life with concert pianist Sara Davis Buechner. Sara Davis Buechner has been hailed by the New York Times for her intelligence, integrity, and all-encompassing technical prowess. As one of the leading keyboard artists of our time, Sara has an active repertoire of over 100 piano concertos and has appeared with prominent orchestras all over the world. Sara was recently appointed to the piano faculty at Temple University's Boyer College of Music and Dance in Philadelphia. Welcome to A Musical Life. I'm Hugh Sung. Sara Davis Buechner first came to prominence as David Buechner, winning the gold medal in the 1984 Gina Bachauer International Piano Competition and the bronze medal in the 1986 Tchaikovsky International Piano Competition in Moscow. Incidentally, as a result of being the only medal winner to perform on a Yamaha piano at the Tchaikovsky International Piano Competition, David was invited to tour Japan and subsequently became the first American Yamaha artist. In 1998, David came out as Sara Davis Buechner and underwent gender reassignment surgery in 2002. Now residing in Philadelphia, I had the opportunity to visit Sara for this interview at her new Center City apartment. Before we start our conversation, let's listen to Sara perform a chanson by Rudolf Frimmel, also known as the Donkey Serenade. Sara, thank you so much for inviting me to your home and for being on the show. What an honor and privilege.
The honor is all mine. The privilege is all mine. Mikasa is Sukasa. And we feel very, very lucky to have you here, actually. I mean, we just moved here, as you know, in late August. And already this is a very, very warm and wonderful home for us. And we're really enjoying getting to know lots of new people and inviting them over and living in this wonderful place, that's for sure.
And congratulations on your new appointment
Mm.
teaching at Temple
Thank you.
University.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm really enjoying that too. I've taught at several other institutions, but this is like a perfect fit somehow. I don't know. The character of the place suits me very, very well. I think the direction the music department there is going in is definitely an upward tangent. And just last night I played a concert with their orchestra. I thought the orchestra sounded magnificent. They have a wonderful conductor, Andreas Delfs, and they have such a beautiful performance space, that Temple Performing Arts Center, which is, of course, the original temple that started the whole university with the beautiful stained glass windows. Anyway, it's a particularly joyous time in my life, I would say. So really nice.
And in some ways, it's an arrival, isn't it? You've had quite an extraordinary musical, artistic, and personal journey as well.
I feel so. It's to use the word extraordinary, that's a very, very big deal, and I wouldn't talk about myself in such a way. But if I look back on it, it's a kind of a journey that has been very much shaped by the history and politics and cultural changes of our times, which, of course, as a child, I never could have predicted. And if I look back over the course of my life, I tend to see it almost like a movie with certain scenes from various times of my life. And the colors are all different, and the music is all different, and the tastes and smells have changed so many times in such profound ways. So my childhood as a young boy growing up in Baltimore in the 1960s, I always see this as black and white. It was a black and white time. And the earliest memories were of the radio playing Mozart, who I just adored. And we had Mozart on the radio and great paintings on the wall that were all reproductions borrowed from the library, and cheap paperbacks of great books, because my parents were poor, but my mother especially wanted us to have a much richer life and bigger opportunities than they had. They had not gone to college.
Oh, I see. I was going to ask, what did your parents do?
My dad worked for the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, and he was a surveyor and an engineer. My mom was a housewife. She was a good Catholic wife and mother, and boy, did she change. She went back to law school later in life, became a very fine lawyer, and worked in the district attorney's office and so forth. My dad later went into business for himself. But my earliest memories of childhood, my parents looked like they walked out of one of those sitcoms of the era, Leave It to Beaver or something, with the dad in a nice suit going to work with the newspaper, and mom at home, ironing and cleaning. She hated every minute of it. The poor woman. And the piano teacher, Miss Wolf, who came to our house, she was a Hungarian refugee. She and her parents had fled Hungary during the uprising of 1956. As she told me later, with bullets whizzing over their heads as they raced over the border barefoot carrying suitcases. It was the first of many such stories I've heard of musical refugees, who shaped my life, people who escaped Europe during the war years or later. My later piano teacher was a wonderful pianist named Ronaldo Reyes, who was a Filipino man, and his stories of growing up under Japanese occupation. Mirrored also, by the way, by tales that Dang Tai Son, the great Vietnamese pianist, told me later of him escaping, Vietnam with his upright piano strapped to the backs of water buffaloes fording rivers. I mean, just unreal stories that people have had surviving traumas and so forth. I never realized at the age of 4 that I would have my own sort of political, personal trauma to face many years later. I mean, the world of 1959, when I was born, was a very, very different kind of place. I think it was kind of an America that some people think we need to make it great again by returning to those fine days of black and white when people had their social strata and milieu and where they belonged and places they didn't go and so forth. But anyway, I don't mean to digress. But
oh, not at all. One of the things I love to explore with this show is to give all of my guests the opportunity to share their perspectives, no matter what they are. And music as an art, as we both know, is such a a lifelong art of exploration as it is.
Mm.
And so thank you so much for being so generous
Oh,
with
oh,
sharing
kind.
your perspective. So what I wanted to do, because your story has been documented so
Sure.
many times, and we could certainly delve into that if you'd like, but I thought it'd be a little more fun to take a few more tangential looks.
Mm.
Grew up in Baltimore, and yet here I come to your wonderful apartment, and um, your wife is Japanese.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
You have an evident love of Asian culture,
Mm-hmm.
evidenced with the Japanese dolls.
Yeah. Yes.
I'm assuming they're Japanese pig dolls too.
There's a few,
yeah,
in
yeah,
there, yes.
so and you speak Japanese as well.
Quite poorly, I would say, but
Better than I can. Trust me.
Itsumo gambarimasu, shall we say, always trying and so forth.
And you're also an honorary member of the
Hanshin Tigers, yes, of
Tigers, a
Osaka.
baseball team.
Yes.
So tell me how your fascination with Asian culture, how did that start?
I can't really lay it to any one particular thing, although, I do have to thank my piano teacher for a lot of this. After I worked as a child with Miss Wolf for a few years, she brought me to her teacher, whose name was Ronaldo Reyes. He was teaching at Peabody at the time, and later he taught at Towson University. He was a Filipino man, and probably the most richly enjoyable human being I've ever met. He was just someone who had a great appetite for life and a great enjoyment of life, and a wonderfully cosmopolitan nature about him. It was quite rare. When you got to know him, you learned quickly that he spoke 8 or 9 languages.
Wow.
Quite fluently, and in the middle of piano lessons, he'd pick up the phone, and you could never tell what language was going to pop out of his mouth. You'd hear English, you'd hear Tagalog, you'd hear Italian, you'd hear Spanish, you'd hear German, you'd hear French, at times Portuguese, Greek. He was learning, he knew some Russian. It was kind of astounding. And for me, growing up in these, I would say, culturally pretty much poverty-stricken area of Northwest Baltimore, the piano lesson became for me a once-a-week trip to the United Nations. It was almost like all of that black and white that I experienced suddenly turned to blazing technicolor when I would go for the piano lesson. And he brought that to the lessons too. I mean, he would describe the directions in Debussy's preludes, in the French. He would start talking about the backgrounds of the words and what the meaning of the words, if something was frisson or something was quand la couleur du sous-terre, or something like that. I'm just bavarding here on the top of my head. But he would go into describing, well, this is what the word means in French, but if you say it in English, we would say it this way. And then, the Russians have a way of explaining that, and that's very, very different. And it was so clear that he just had a kind of a joyous love of all these different cultures and the richness of the human experience. That's what I very much gained out of him, well beyond, how to play the piano or the technical exercises or all the years of scales and arpeggios and Bach that he really drilled me in, was this cosmopolitan thirst. And especially because he traveled a lot to the Philippines. He went back and forth all the time. And his descriptions of things there, his joy of going there and to places like China and Japan, I think that fueled my interest in all of that. It seemed so far away, and yet he was going there all the time. What was out there, And his own teacher, who was a great student of Busoni named Mieczysław Muntz, who I later worked with a little bit, was also a great lover of Asia and actually spent some years teaching in Toho. He was a foreign professor there.
That's one of the premier music schools in Tokyo, is that
yes,
right?
absolutely, yes. And I didn't get to know Mr. Muntz on a very personal level. I was about 14 when I played for him, and he was an old school teacher. He didn't talk to you about personal things. He was just, you'll take that crescendo there, yes? Said, yes, sir. Yes, sir. May I have another? But I knew that about him, and it was just, it sounded intriguing and slightly dangerous and kind of amazing to me. But I don't want it to sound like, it was just Asia that fascinated me. I mean, especially lately, I'm more and more interested in South America, and Latin America is also kind of an amazing part of the world. I already knew that, classical music was the bastion of Europe, and Europe is beautiful and wonderful. And I learned French in high school. I learned a little Russian also, but French culture I just loved, and I loved the French paintings and all that. Um, but but all of this seemed delicious and intriguing, and I still say to people, though, that of all the places that I've traveled that I somehow love Japan the most, because it seems to be the most, to me, I would say it's the most poetic country in the world, at least that I've yet experienced. There's a grace to the manners, there's a grace to the language, there's grace to the temples, there's a grace to the general politeness of living there that I very, very much appreciate. And one thing about Japanese culture that I would say exists almost exclusively these days. I feel like it used to be so in America, maybe not nearly as much anymore. In Japan, you have the sense that no matter who people are or what they do or their station in life, that they take enormous pride in what they do, and that what they do is indeed who they are. And I feel this profoundly as a musician, because of course, to play music every day is not a job at all. It's not what we do. It is indeed who we are. We're constantly espousing who we are. And to be able to do that every day, you either have to be an incredible narcissist and super egoist, which I am, or you have to acknowledge that to be human is to discover something new every day of your life. There's always some new color that you didn't know before. I feel that when I sit down at the piano, actually, that what I'm really mostly looking for, beyond keeping technique in shape, learning new repertoire, expanding my knowledge of music in general, is a sense that on this instrument, I want to get a new color that I haven't gotten before, and keep making it more and more kaleidoscopic. Color is very, very important to me as a pianist, as a musician. I'll digress and go backwards one last time to earliest memory, because here I must really thank my mother also, again, for not only having that music playing in the house and encouraging me to read and encouraging me to look at artworks, but I've never forgotten how she took me to the Walters Art Gallery in Baltimore. I was probably about 4 years old at the time, and holding my hand quite tightly and telling me, leaning over to say, "Shh, you must be quiet here, because this is a very special place." She made me feel like museums and concert halls were sacred places, that religion took place there, that this was a temple of something. And so for me, what I drank from the walls of those museums, not only that one, but of course later in New York, in the Frick Museum, and the Hispanic Society, and the Metropolitan, all these great spaces. And whenever I travel, I like to go to the museums and see what there is on the walls there. We're so full of color and shading, and I tell people very often, I learned a lot about Debussy from teachers and from reading Schmitz's great book on it and various sources, but I learned as much about playing that music by looking and studying canvases of Renoir and Sisley and Monet and Cassatt as anything else, just to see the range of the colors and touches and sensitivities to light as possible. You can see that in the notes. I often say, one of my standard lines is, you're looking at those keys and you see black and white, but now you have to play color, and the richer the color you can get out of it, the better it's going to be.
I'd like to touch on your moments of great courage, if
Oh,
I may
aren't
say.
you kind to compliment me like that?
Well, if I were to try to put myself in the shoes of trying to make a decision that could jeopardize everyone I know, every opportunity I know, that's a terrifying thought, and yet that's something that you faced, and it's something that you had to confront when it came time for you to decide, you formerly being David, and deciding to pursue a life as Sara. I would say many people would. I'm trying to understand what emboldened you, or how did you persevere through a very terrifying process. I mean, it's one thing now to look back and see the dots that connected. I'm curious about the moment before, because with an uncertain future, and especially with classical music being as conservative as it is, the students are trained to try to win jobs teaching, try to win jobs in orchestras. And pianists have the most precarious jobs of all, because we don't have orchestras per se. Teaching jobs are far and few between unless you run your own studio. Being a performing pianist is extraordinarily difficult to begin with. And then you were looking, I imagine, at the prospect of pretty scary times. What was going through your mind, or were you able to look past that and just feed on the art, as you mentioned, being fueled by the art itself? I mean, it sounds romantic, but is it pragmatic?
There was nothing romantic about it at all. I mean, you're very prescient to realize that the pursuit of the art actually led me to the decision, and I regret that it came to such a big decision, mostly because I had been in such denial, all of my life. I mean, as with any transgendered person, this is something I knew from earliest memory, and I...
Even as a child?
Oh, as a child, I knew this, I certainly in school, the teachers are calling my parents and saying, how come he's always playing with the girls, and what's the matter with this kid? This kind of stuff,
And how did your parents have a sense early on? Were they also repressing what they suspected?
I think they just, in great denial.
I see.
We had, you have to remember, it really was a very different time.
Yeah.
People just never spoke of such things. And I'm thinking of the first direct contact I had with someone who was quote unquote different was our 5th grade homeroom teacher, Mr. Naiman. People would say, oh, Mr. Naiman is funny. And this was the euphemism for saying, well, Mr. Naiman is homosexual. Mr. Naiman is gay. And everyone knew it, just like we knew there were gay characters on television, but you never talked about it. And the one place that these people held was they were sort of like the class clown. They were funny, they had funny mannerisms and they spoke funny, And that was the box that people put gay men into. And maybe my parents were fearful that that was going to be a box that I was going to be shoved into. I mean, they had no way of really understanding my deepest feelings about the matter. When I told my mother that I wanted to wear this hat, or I wanted to wear that dress, or can I wear that lipstick, etc., she ignored it or danced around it, or on one memorable occasion washed my mouth out with soap, which didn't work very well because actually soap tastes pretty good, depending on what flavor you use. It's I think it was Rose Camay. I mean, I look back on all that now with a certain bemusement and sadness, because of course later in life my mother, who was a very wise woman, grew and changed, and I think felt very, very badly about all these things. I'm not sure my father ever understood it or will ever understand it, but that's okay. He was raised in a different time and how people perceived it. I grew up with this kind of compact within myself, thinking, well, I'm making this career as a young male pianist, and if I look into that closet and see what's in there, it'll jeopardize everything, so better not go there. And even to the point of, when in the later 1980s, early 1990s, for the first time, remember this is pre-internet days, how do you find information about this? I started to see in a bookstore things about people who were transgender, or trans this, trans that, and I got some of these books and started to read. Oh my God, there's other people like me. I mean, the isolation of it was my worst ally at the time, because I just didn't dare talk to people, except a couple of therapists. I had been seeing psychotherapists and told mostly bad and crazy advice from them about this kind of stuff, which all led to, repression. In any case, when I started to read those books, I started to think, well, okay, maybe I'm, this is the story, but I better repress this because I'll get in trouble. Or what if I actually did take these hormones? I'll change my body and then maybe I can't play or something. I have some dumb excuses like this. Basically, though, into my 30s is when I began to just allow myself to be who I was. and eventually demanded. And there came a very memorable day, and I'm open about it. I tell people it was my conversation with God. I was walking across Central Park after a meeting with my manager in the afternoon, and I laid down on this rock, and it was a beautiful late autumn day, and in November 1996, and I laid down on that rock, and I tell people honestly, it was like the voice of God within me said, do you want to go there? And I replied, I said, I don't want to go there. I need to go there. I need to go there. That's who I am. I just have to be that person. And it's so funny, the years of conflict and torment and self-hatred, honestly, that goes on with such stuff, vanished for me in a second. And I was completely sure that this was the right path in my life. Whereas I now had this experience of watching a movie unfold all around me, starting with telling my parents that this was what I was going to do. People going hysterical and ballistic and screaming and shouting and being shocked and upset, and for the next year and a half until, sort of coming out, and seeing friends disappear, and seeing jobs disappear, and concerts disappear, and conductors disappear, and chamber music partners disappear, everything disappear, to a point where I literally was pretty close to homeless at one point until I got a small teaching job at a children's school.
I want to interrupt for just a second. We're transitioning from a moment of relief of what you discovered about yourself, and then of course this tremendous difficulty,
career change,
career change, but also your community of who you thought were your friends, and associates. At any point during this difficult time, did you say, maybe did I make the wrong decision? Did you?
No.
Interesting.
No. Okay. No, I had no moments of that whatsoever. No, I was absolutely sure I was being true to myself. And the piano playing really pointed me in that direction. I was coming to the point in my life where I was becoming a professional actor full-time on stage. I was just acting the role of concert pianist, It didn't feel like it was me at all. It was just like, I remember one particularly, for me, horrible performance with an orchestra in California. I played the Beethoven Emperor Concerto, and I listened back to the recording of it afterwards, and it was just loud and bangy, and it was like some boxer playing the piano. I hated it. It didn't have a shred of sensitivity to it. I was just muscling my way through things on the concert stage. I wasn't playing artistically. I didn't even know what music meant to me anymore. It was just like, it really was turning into a job. And I couldn't face it. I hated it. I just hated not being me. And, to go on stage where, as I had felt as a child, that it was a temple where you reveal your innermost thoughts and you're true to yourself and you share it with people, and be a phony. That's terrible. That was just horrible. I think anybody living in the closet feels that way.
If you don't mind, I'd love to touch on your relationship with a remarkable company. I say this because as I was reading your history, particularly of all the professional organizations that deserted you, that wouldn't book you, that wouldn't want to associate with you, yet there was this one company which, if I had been a betting man, would think would have followed all of these other corporate decisions, and yet they stood by you.
Oh, yeah, they sure did.
Can you tell us a little bit about your
That's a very funny story, actually. I at the time that the transition was sort of imminent, I made a short list of about 5 people that I thought I need to tell these people so they know what's coming. And one of them was Eric Johnson, who was the head of artist relations at Yamaha at the time. And I had known Eric for a long, long time. Before he was at Yamaha, he was working for Bosendorfer, which was associated with Kimball at the time. Anyway, so I made a lunch date with Eric, and I had done things with Eric, including going to cigar smoking functions with him. Actually, he was a cigar smoker. And took him to lunch, and I said, "Well, I've got something very important I want to tell you." And it's so funny that he's told me, and he told people later, he said, I was so upset. He was going to He was going to tell me he was switching to Steinway. But I told him, I said, look, I'm going through this gender transition, and my name is going to be this, and blah, blah, blah. And he was a little, taken aback, and then he said, are you sure you got the legs for this? Can you imagine he said that? And I said, I hope so. And he said, well, we'll see. And he drank a toast. And I thought at the time I would give up all the cigars. I gave him a very expensive humidor that I had as a present. I said, this is my transition present for you. And he took me back to the office, told his secretary, Susan Davies, and Susan Davies went out, I think a week later with me, helped me pick my concert gown for my first concert as Sara. So they were aces to me. I mean, they were just marvelous. But these are the kind of wonderful people that Yamaha has had, that I've worked with over the years. And, we all know that, look, I love the piano, and I would always play that piano, I believe. But, the personal association you have with people, it's people connections that mean everything to us, So
I still find that remarkable. I mean, Yamaha is the largest music manufacturing company in the world. And maybe coming from a certain corporate perspective, I'd be worried about reputation, blah, blah, blah,
who
blah.
knows? I don't know.
And yet they persevered, and they were with you.
Yeah.
And
always,
one of the few organizations.
It is one of the few.
That's supportive.
The manager I had at the time was extremely supportive, but he got very frustrated. He just couldn't get me bookings at the time. When I told him I was going to change agents, he said, well, we love having you. He says, and I'm going to miss you. He says, but I think it's the right move. He said, we can't really do anything for you. I felt so bad about that, and then the manager took me on, just couldn't get me anything either. Yeah. It was just a very futile time in my life. But that didn't really mean a thing to me. I mean, I had been playing a lot of concerts. I knew a lot of people. I was surprised by people who didn't return phone calls anymore, particularly conductors. Shocked and upset about that. But the inner peace that I had, the conviction of that, carried me through all of it. And at the time in my life when I lost a conservatory job also, that was terrible. They treated me horribly. But, I went to this children's school in Westchester, and I asked for a job. And this woman knew who I was. And she said, why do you want to teach kids here? She was like really shocked and surprised. And I said, well, I just can't get a job anywhere. And
you were actually forthright, just to
I
say.
did. Yeah. Well, I mean, I said to her, I'm just not being able to get a job. And she said, well, of course, we'd be honored to have you. And she said, and she doubled the salary range for me. And she and then I was teaching 5- and 6-year-olds at this school. And, and I thought, when I was in my 20s, to make ends meet, I sometimes taught little kids. And I hated every damn minute of it. I just thought it was demeaning and horrible, And when I took that job, I thought to myself, look, everything in your life is an opportunity. Let's make this a great opportunity. Let's learn how to teach kids, because I've never been good at it. I wasn't good at it. And I became a very good teacher of children at the time in my life. I think I've never enjoyed teaching as much as I enjoyed teaching at that time, because I quickly figured out the problem that I had as a young teacher in my 20s, was that, if you look down on what you do, then you're not going to do it well. That's sort of like the Japanese perspective, right? So I thought, okay, I'm honored to teach these kids. What is the most important thing that I can teach them? It wasn't whether they put their second finger on the correct note. That's not important ultimately, especially for young kids who probably don't have musical talent. The most important thing for me to do, I thought, was the end of this half hour, I want them to walk out of this room smiling and in love with music and happy. So either they'll want to learn music more, or they'll want to listen to music, but somehow music is going to be a part of their life forever, if I make it joyous for them, as it was for me when I was young. And that became my whole raison d'etre. And I became a very popular teacher there. And those kids cried when I left. I mean, they hugged me, they cried, they told me they loved the piano. I thought I had never done as good a teaching job as I had for those young kids when I taught there. And I would never mind returning to that, it was a time in my life that I look back on it, it's not a shred of sadness. I mean, there were some terrible days and terrible things said to me. My family wasn't even, talking to me at the time. For all the bad things that happened, I look back on that as one of the real golden times in my life. There were some very, very magical things about that time in my life.
You know, I've had the great privilege of knowing you just for a few short months since your move here to Philadelphia, and it's been an absolute delight. So I feel badly that I almost feel like I've known you far longer than we actually have. In the brief time that we've known each other, I mean, you've come across as someone, well, obviously very much at ease with yourself, but also somebody that has a tremendous joie de vivre. You have a wonderful joy of life. There's something just happy about you, and I mean, we joke, we have fun, and you're just such such an optimistic perspective. And yet, I do know, again, just from what I've read, that you did have your depressive moments.
Oh, sure.
You did have difficult times.
Yeah.
And I have to say, I'm struggling to see any traces of that here right now.
Well, you got me in a good mood.
There you go.
Had a good concert yesterday. I don't think the lows will return in the way that they did. I mean, that was really at the time when I was experimenting with my gender identity and not sure I would really had the strength or the courage of my convictions to do what I kind of deep down really wanted to do. And just being unsure of myself, that was a particularly terrible time in my life. But you know, I don't know. Depression is a scary thing, and you know, when basics of your life are not in order, then awful things can happen for sure. But again, it's an incredible learning opportunity. Certainly, you learn the ways of the mind and the heart at such times, and I think I gained an enormous amount of resilience and strength from that time in my life. And as far as, what comes across as optimism or joie de vivre, I guess I have a certain innate belief, maybe it's watching too many 1940s movies, that there's going to be a happy ending somewhere, that things will essentially be okay in the end. So I don't know. I do like to have fun in life, and it's brief enough, and it flies by more quickly than any of us could ever imagine. If there's not a few laughs and good meals and a couple of some, well, a story comes to mind of a pianist, a very famous pianist who I don't like very much. And I met him. I was introduced to him in the cafeteria of the Manhattan School of Music one day. He was giving some master class or something. And one of my classmates there, this is when I was getting my doctoral degree with Byron Janis, and one of my classmates comes running up to me, and she's so excited. Oh, so-and-so's here. So-and-so's here. Don't you want to meet so-and-so, And I think so-and-so knows me from Baltimore days. And I said, well, sure, okay. And went down to the cafeteria. And here was, I'll just call him the great man. Okay. Someone once referred to him as a legend in his spare time, which I
like that.
Yeah, it's a very good line. I'll tell you later after the interview who we're talking about. But he was seated at this table. It was almost like Christ with the apostles. There's all these eager-eyed students staring at the great man. Someone brings me up to him and introduces me. This is David Buechner. Do you know? He leans back and gives me this look, this sort of, with the arched Mr. Spock-like eyebrow and so forth. He's nodding his head up and down, and sort of looking like Sigmund Freud. He extends his hand, and his hand had been, I don't want to give it away, his hand had some damage to it, and it was this kind of unpleasant feeling. I shook his hand. It was like acknowledging the difficulties, really profound difficulties this fellow had. And he said, and what are you doing here? He said judgmentally. And I said, well, I'm getting a doctorate. I'm studying with Byron Janis. He said, what is your thesis about? He said. I said, I'm writing a paper about the history of cadenzas to the Mozart concertos, and I'm writing my own set of cadenzas. And he says, And he looked at me very quizzically. And here came sort of like the big money question. He said, and what if you fail? He said. And instantly what went through my head was, honestly, old man, isn't that rather pathetic? I didn't say this in my head. I was thinking, he's 70 plus. He's distinguished. He's revered. He's beloved. He's made some very famous recordings that I admire, and all these things. And here he is, and he's got nothing better to do with his time than sit in this cafeteria and play mind games with a kid like me. I thought I kind of felt sorry for him in a way, but he asked me that. But I also, in a second, thought to myself, if this was my piano teacher, I'd probably be jumping off the roof. He asked me, young 20-year-olds who are looking for finding themselves, and someone asks them, profoundly, penetrating needlepoint questions like that, which can cause you self-doubt for the rest of your life. And what if you fail? And I just smiled. I said, I'll go bowling. How about you? It was one of the happiest smart-ass moments of my whole life. Because, so what if you fail?
Yeah.
What's the big deal about that? What would he want me to say? I'll go into analysis for the rest of my life with a strict Freudian and never eat meat again.
That's one of the oddities of the classical music pedagogical culture, isn't it? It's this teacher worship. It's the putting the teacher as master. Part of it is because of the one-on-one instructive model. It comes down to us from the Moscow conservatory model, and where the teacher is the absolute authority, and your life is basically in your teacher's hands, for good or for ill. And one of the things that struck me, though, as you were describing your interaction with your students, though, is the tremendous care that you have to expand their minds beyond just music. And we were doing a quick video shoot for something else right before this, and you were telling me about how you insisted some of your students get dictionaries, paper dictionaries. Well, they said, we have dictionary apps on our phones, and you had a very interesting reason why you insisted they get paper dictionaries. I wonder if you could just share that little story again. That's just one example of how you're trying to get your students to.
Yeah, I want them to think outside the box, and of course, we all have had our boxes. When I was a kid, you always studied Hanon. Now, you had to study Hanon. Now, why do you have to study Hanon? Hanon is like mind deadening. I like the third part where he has the scales written out with the arch correct fingerings, and I still tell people to look that up and use it. But the first part is just deadly dull exercise and why is that? Why would you want to do that? Many years later, I discovered ways to stretch and practice my fingers, which is not only not deadly dull, but sort of expands your head and so forth. And the Brahms exercises are already much, much better. So that's one small example. But, okay, so these young people have grown up in an age where their smartphone has everything. Their phone is very, very smart, and they might be very dumb, but the phone is so smart, so who cares? So, yes, these are class of students from another country, and I told them to get paper dictionaries, and one of them actually said, "No, I don't need that. I've got it." And I said, "Okay, then you don't need to learn, I guess." I asked them to get the dictionary because of my own experience studying Japanese. That first of all, to hold the dictionary in your hand is to appreciate the depth and the weight of all of those words. What does it feel like, to pick up a dictionary and what is the amount of stuff in there that you do not know? It's staggering. Another reason I wanted them to get those paper dictionaries is reading about the great film director Billy Wilder, who was a German immigrant. When he came to Hollywood in 1940 or something, bought a dictionary and taught himself 10 words a day, random words out of the dictionary. And in 5 years' time, he got an Academy Award for the screenplay for Double Indemnity. And that's a pretty inspiring story, dictionary story for you. But also when studying Japanese, I'd know when I had to look up a word, I'd have to find it. And I didn't know that alphabet. And I wasn't comfortable with that alphabet. And it taught me, how to find the word. Where is the word's place in the totality of that language? And then, of course, all the words around it that you see. And in English language, in French language, in German, all these Western languages, the prefixes or the suffixes have so much to do with, what the meaning of that word is. So I was talking to them about counterpoint. What does counter mean? What does con mean? Look at all the words that begin with C-O-N. There's 37 pages of words that begin with the letters C-O-N. It's incredible. And I said, don't just learn the one word. Look at all those other words. See what the interaction of those words, the relationship of those words. You have to see that. You have to feel it. It's a tactile thing, as well as if you look up one word on your smartphone, you've possibly learned one word and you probably forget it very, very soon. But if you look up that one word and then learn the 35 words around it, you'll remember that word and all those derivatives for the rest of your life. And you're well on your way to learning that language. So, yeah, I want them to use the appropriate tools for the appropriate job. Just as I sometimes say to them, if you have a nail and you need to drive it in the wall, are you going to use your cell phone for that? No. I think you better go buy a hammer, okay? On the other hand, if you have to remember somebody's phone number, don't look it up on the hammer. It's not too useful.
It works to an extent.
I don't like the idea that people just buy this thing and they say, okay, now I have all that I need for the rest of my life. It's not really quite like that, And I don't have the mindset of someone who's grown up with those tools. This morning we were at the diner having breakfast, and a 2-year-old behind us was learning how to take photos with the smartphone, and parents were showing, And I commented, I said, that kid is more comfortable with that smartphone than I am. It's I have high hopes, though, that that's the generation that will better adapt to those things. If they use them from earliest age, they'll know what they can do and what they can't do. I just hope parents don't throw out all the books in the meantime because, that's old.
Interestingly, you had, we again, during our video shoot, you had described yourself as, how shall we say, technologically challenged, and yet you have also done some extensive work with some very interesting piano technologies like Yamaha's disc clavier, and you actually have an interesting hybrid piano, a Yamaha hybrid avant-garde piano. And you've come up with some very interesting technological approaches. I'm wondering if you could describe your work with some of those cutting-edge technologies coming from somebody who has some reservations about what technology can and can't do.
I think it's, when I sit down to use those tools, I don't think to myself, okay, let me find something novel to do that I've never done before. It's more like in working with those tools, you discover things that they can help you with, So I would say particularly I think it was in the later 1980s, I went to Buena Park quite a few times and made several discs for the disc clavier system. And it really was fascinating to me. Of course, my first impulse was, okay, play, and then it'll reproduce it and it'll be just what you want. Well, no, it wasn't. First of all, the pedal technology really wasn't as well developed then as it is now. So we had things about the pedal that we wanted to adjust. But I was so fascinated to see on the playback, that doesn't look like player piano rolls that I've seen. Like the notes were all kind of uneven and wobbly, and I brushed this and I hit this wrong note, and I don't know what I want to do with that. So first, looking at the computer screen, we start to fix wrong notes. Okay, that's a basic thing. Now we're thinking about, how about the attacks of these chords? Do you really want those dead on? Do you really want that chord broken? How do you want that? You realize you're constantly adjusting because of the feel of your fingers, and chords never really go down precisely. So is it worth your while to readjust that on the computer so the notes strike precisely? Oh, no, that sounds kind of mechanical. It's correct, but it doesn't sound good. But it doesn't look good to the consumer if the things aren't going down the right. You start making artistic choices about what voicings are more important than other voicings. One of the first really great things I did with that disc clavier was in the Brahms variations on an original theme. I think it's Opus 21, number 1 or 2. I think it's number 1. There are chords that Brahms included in there that are so widely spaced that most pianists have to break those chords. I didn't want to hear those chords broken. I always wanted to hear them solidly as Brahms played them and envisioned them. And I was okay, so we can record this. I'll just play these 2 notes. Now we'll go and we'll over-record and we'll overdub that note so the 3 notes are sounding precisely as I wanted them to sound, as Brahms wanted them to sound. It's like, now wait a minute, he wanted a bell tone out of that D. What if we just leave that note down so that it rings to the chord? I don't even have to use the center pedal for that. Let's just leave the note down. Now we're arriving at something that no pianist has actually ever created, but is probably really close to what the composer really wanted. Isn't that magical? That's a fantastic thing. So there's an example of using the technology to attain some sort of artistic aims.
Actually, if I may even interject, the way I'm hearing you describe it is using the art to push the technology.
Push technology forward, right? Exactly.
It's if you're just looking from a technical point of view, it's one thing, but because you had an artistic leaning and a sense that determined, as you saw, back then they had pedal limitations, they had other resolution limitations. Not to say that everything's perfect now, but the art forces the technology to advance, which in turn seems to open possibilities for greater art. And it's wonderful when it's a symbiotic relationship, which you seem to be bringing.
No, it was kind of fascinating, and I remember we recorded the Brahms Handel variations as well, and we got to the fugue, and for practical considerations, I said, fugue's pretty tough. I said, I can play it at speed, and then we can try to fix wrong notes and so forth, But of course, what happens in concert when you're playing rapidly, you're constantly making small, unthought out adjustments. Your ear is guiding you to, okay, you're playing through the thirds, but you're highlighting the top voice, and it's not going to be a perfectly legato string of thirds. You're always sort of adjusting for that. And I thought, I bet I can save us all on editing time and get a better performance. Let's record this at about 80% tempo. And I did. And then we sped it up. And it sounded fabulous. and I thought to myself, if Glenn Gould were alive today, the stuff he would do with that. And it's not just a matter of, I can hit more right notes. It's really like, arriving at, of course, in that fugue, it's an arch classical kind of sound that you want. And there, I actually wanted a sound that was not so human, was a little bit mechanical. Why not? It's exalted. It's kind of fantastic. So that was the most obvious example. I thought, let me use what this piano can do, and we'll make a really, really great recording of that. So it's really, really nice. I'm sure there are composers and so forth, like think about stemming from the school of Conlon Nankara, who used that disc clavier in much more remarkable ways with quarter tones and writing pieces where they're played simultaneously in two different places and all this kind of stuff. I'm not a composer, so that doesn't particularly fascinate me. But I think one thing that I thought of a long, long time ago and kind of ditched because I asked, it wasn't Eric Johnson, it was after Eric Johnson's time, but I asked whoever was running Yamaha at that time, I said, here's a great idea. What do you think about this? And they just didn't answer me because it's just ridiculous. I was taking a vacation in Montauk, Long Island, which is the most easternmost point in the United States. And I just love that spot. You're looking over the Atlantic Ocean and thinking, wow, next stop is Ireland, right? And I thought, what if you put a disc clavier piano right here, and then you put one at the coast of Ireland, and you have the transatlantic concert for two pianos. And each piano is playing its part, but you can hear through the disc clavier, the other part is coming over simultaneously, and then you have on the screen, you can see the two pianos aren't together, but they're playing simultaneously, and you're linking the continents. Of course, the money involved in doing that would be like NASA or something, right? But it's not a bad idea, And someday they're going to do it. I mean, we recently saw that demonstration they had at Yamaha, the master class going on, and it's really interesting that Yamaha's technology is way ahead of the video at this point, which surprised me. I would think that the video they'd have down, but they don't quite, So, but that's something I would love to see, stuff like that, like pianists playing, and one is in Chile, the other's in, Kazakhstan, right? And they have a duo piano concert. Why not? That's cool.
Sara, I'd love to close off with a couple of fun questions for you.
Uh-oh.
And
sounds dangerous.
No, it's more of a kind of a
smiling.
Give me a just. I discovered that you are a bourbon drinker.
Yes.
So please give us your maybe a couple recommendations of your favorite bourbons to drink.
Okay, well, here's my standard line. The woman I'm about to mention would be really, really angry at me if I say it, but it's one of my favorite party lines. I was introduced to the splendors of bourbon by a lesbian nun from Kentucky. Okay, there we go. And I rented an artist's cabin down outside of Louisville, Kentucky a few years ago. I was writing. I have a book that I'm working on, and I wrote most of the book during that time. I didn't even have a piano. I didn't want to practice for like a month. I just wrote this book. I was writing it, like practicing 8-10 hours a day. On the weekends, the artist retreat was on the grounds of this convent, and it's a beautiful convent, and they have a church, and there was a piano in the church, and I gave them a couple of concerts while I was there. But other than that, I didn't play the piano. Anyway, so this sister was a great drinker of bourbon, and she took me each weekend. We'd go on a tour of the bourbon distilleries. So we visited Jim Beam and Maker's Mark and Woodford and one other, maybe Four Roses. I can't recall. And it's fascinating. I mean, these places are wonderful. I mean, they show you the whole process of how they make the bourbon, and they siphon off this, and how they store it in the barrels, and how long they keep the barrels, and the various flavors. And each one is different. I mean, it's kind of amazing, right? So this nun was very fond of Maker's Mark. That was her thing. She liked her mint juleps and her Maker's Mark. So we had a lot of that. but I like Woodford Reserve. It's a little bit, to me, has an even warmer, richer taste than Maker's Mark. I like Maker's Mark. It's fine. I'm not too fond of Jim Beam. To me, they're thinner. That's a way that I would describe them. But Woodford Reserve, and particularly their double oaked Woodford Reserve, is just the perfect drink for relaxing with friends. You're sitting around, you're feeling warm and cuddly. You don't have to play the piano, because after one drink, I can't play anything, But talking about politics or economics or films or art or something very unrelated. And the last Woodford Reserve I had was a nice cup with a fabulous writer. His name is Robert Merry. There's his book about the Alsop brothers, who were great. They were relatives of Roosevelt and journalists in the 1940s and 50s. And we sat around. I was at his house outside of Seattle a few weeks ago, and sipping Woodford Reserve, discussing the presidencies of Roosevelt and Truman with that man. I felt very distinguished. Bourbon makes you feel distinguished. Let's put it that way.
All right.
Yep.
Now let's move on to favorite cigar, because I know you're
Cigars,
also
yes.
quite the cigar aficionado.
Unfortunately, I could not strip myself. At the time I transitioned, I thought, well, the cigars have to go, because women just don't smoke cigars. That's saying. And it was so dumb, because of course Georges Sand smoked cigars, and she had a good effect on Chopin. So I just like them a lot. They're very relaxing for practicing. And I will blame my piano teacher, Rudolf Verkushny, for this, because he smoked a pipe all the time. In the lesson, I would come into his room. It was just full of the most magical cherry blend tobacco smell. It's a very sweet odor, and a much more likable odor than cigars. Cigar smoke, I mean, Kayako can't stand it. And I promised her I wouldn't smoke it here in the house, and I generally don't, except when I have a super difficult project I'm working on. Then I'm sorry, I just open up the window as best I can, and I go at it. For many years, my favorite cigar was the La Gloria Cubana, which is actually raised in Miami, not in Cuba. I'm not so crazy. Cuban cigars tend to be strong, a little spicy, very heavy. However, the Monte Cristo No. 2 is a classic. And of the milder Dominican cigars that I really prefer, I like the Ashton Cabinet Reserve, and I am very fond of the most beloved cigar of both Arthur Rubinstein and Alfred Cortot, and that is the Davidoff No. 2. The Davidoff No. 2 is a great cigar, and there are photographs of Rubinstein with his cigar smoking, because he thought that was elegant. Probably nobody else did, but he did. And there's a famous photo. I've been searching for it. I've seen it, and I can't seem to find it, of Alfred Cortot stepping off a plane. He's got his Homburg hat in one hand, and his cigar in the other. It's just fabulous. So old habits die hard. I understand why these folks smoked. I mean, practicing the piano hours on end is a lonely thing, and I do find it very relaxing. It's the smoke is calming and soothing and sort of relaxing, and the act of smoking has a kind of, it'll probably kill me someday, and I'll turn into one of those television ads where half of my neck has been, operated on. It is gone. I'm talking through a hole in the side of my chest. Saying, I hope not.
My last question for you, because I know you love baseball.
Yes.
Favorite position to play, and I guess it's a
Favorite
two-part
position to play.
question. Did you ever get a chance to throw a pitch for the Hanshin Tigers, which you are an honorary member
I
of?
did not. My closest,
Oh.
my most honored moment in baseball was many years ago in a summer festival in Minneapolis. Leonard Slatkin, the conductor, and I went onto the field at the old Minnesota Twin Dome, and we accompanied Roberta Peters. She sang the national anthem, and we played, I believe I played the bottom of the bass part. We just winged it. We were just improvising. We played the national anthem. That's the closest marriage of music and baseball I've had. However, I did make a video of Meet the Mets, the New York Mets theme song. And this is the American team I root for now. And on Mets Pride Night last year, it was shown on the Jumbotron. They showed me playing the Yamaha CFX, and it said courtesy of Yamaha. It was a great plug for Yamaha. And there I was playing, Meet the Mets, meet the Mets, step right up and greet the Mets. I just love the New York Mets for that. My teacher, Mr. Reyes, loved baseball. I don't know, Filipinos seem to like baseball, and they actually play it in high school. And he would interrupt the lessons when I was a kid, when the Baltimore Orioles had playoff games, and they played a lot of games on Saturday. In the middle of a lesson, I remember him saying, "I'm sorry, we have to stop now because the Orioles are playing. We have to go see it." And we drive over to my grandma's house. She lived nearby, and we on a big color. She had a color TV set, which we didn't, and we turn it on. And by far, favorite position has got to be, number one favorite position is pitcher. Number two would be shortstop. Those are the most musical positions. You have to be lithe, you have to be creative. And Mr. Ray is really impressed upon me. My dad didn't really care about sports very much. He didn't talk to me about sports. Mr. Ray is really did. And he said, look at the pitcher, look at the signs receiving from the catcher, and look at the chamber music that's going on between these two. It is a form of chamber music, guessing what's the right direction, what's the right velocity, what's the right speed, what is the angle you're going to go for, how are you going to do that, climbing into the mind of that batter and saying, how can I, what is he looking for, what can I throw that he's totally not expecting. That's a fascinating part of baseball. And it makes baseball a much richer game than any other sport, as far as I'm concerned. The shortstop, I like the way they jump around, and they're lithe and athletic, and that's very, very nice. But that pitcher-catcher thing, that's an amazing thing. And the pitcher that I saw as a kid that really thrilled me was Jim Palmer. He had this curveball that just did amazing things. And the way he threw it, you could tell that even though he was throwing that ball in excess of 90 miles an hour, there was no strain involved, there was no difficulty. I wanted to play the piano like that. I didn't want to play the piano in such a way it looks like it's hard work. I mean, he would throw that curveball on his whole body. It was clear it wasn't just his hand, his whole body. And I have quoted this to piano students quite a bit, by the way, telling them that the most important physical activity they can do as pianists is to exercise their legs a lot and go running, because that's what pitchers always say. People think they throw with their arms. They don't. They throw with their entire body, starting with the power that's in their lower legs. And we play the piano in a very similar way. I mean, the fingers have to be well practiced, but when you want the power and the dexterity and the strength that will give you the ability to play for 6 to 8 hours without stopping, like in a recording session or a competition or God knows whatever, that all comes from your lower legs, your butt, your torso, your midsection. It doesn't come from. If you play all from the upper body, you're just going to injure yourself. It's the same as pitching, So baseball is very, very valuable. I should say that like an Asian philosopher. You want to be like this. It's like a Charlie Chan movie, right? People speak in fortune cookie aphorisms. Want to be a successful musician, please to study baseball.
Sarah.
Yes.
thank you so much for just a delightful time
Well, thank you, Hugh.
chatting and just getting to know you better. And really, thank you so much. It's such a delight.
Delight's all mine, Hugh. Thanks. You come anytime, all right? All right.
For links to Sarah's website, visit the show notes at amusicallife.com. While you're there, be sure to sign up for our newsletter to get the latest updates on future episodes. You can also subscribe to A Musical Life through iTunes or with your favorite podcast playing app and get new episodes automatically downloaded onto your smartphone, tablet, or computer. If you enjoy these stories about making music and the things that move our souls, please tell a friend about this show and consider posting a short review on iTunes at amusicallife.com/review. Thank you for your support. Until next time, I'm Hugh Sung, and I wish you a musical life.